Have you ever wondered how Joe Biden's presidency intersects with the darkest chapter of justice, capital punishment? Despite federal moratoriums, state executions under his watch reveal a tapestry of humanity at its bleakest. Each prisoner's final words and meals offer a haunting glimpse into regret, defiance, and fleeting peace. Dive in below to witness their last moments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime deep dives. Lisa Marie Montgomery. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Marie Montgomery, a 52-year-old mother of two from Kansas, became the first woman executed by the federal government in 67 years. In December 2004, Montgomery deceived Bobby Jo Stinnett, a small-town Missouri dog breeder, into believing she wanted to adopt a puppy. Once inside Stinnett's home, Montgomery strangled the 8-month pregnant Stinnett, took her unborn baby by cutting her from the womb, and fled with the infant. Investigators tracked Montgomery to Arkansas, where she was arrested 2 days later. Her trial was moved to federal court due to the crime crossing state lines. Psychiatrists testified that Montgomery suffered from severe mental illness, including delusions tied to a history of violence and abuse, but the jury found her criminally responsible. On the night before her execution, she asked for a final viewing of her 1-year-old daughter and wrote letters pleading for compassion. Montgomery's last meal was a standard federal prison microwavable meal and a vanilla milkshake. Her request for a special meal was denied. At 1:31 a.m. Central Time, she spoke no last words, but witnesses noted she appeared calm. Her execution by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute symbolized the government's rare use of capital punishment on a female inmate. Corey Johnson. On January 14, 2021, Corey Johnson, a 52-year-old former gang member from Virginia, was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute. In 1992, Johnson led a violent gang that fatally shot 4 people in a Kansas City parking lot as part of a drug dispute. After a high-speed chase, he was arrested in Missouri and extradited to federal authorities. His 2002 federal trial revealed his role in ordering and coordinating the murders, and he was sentenced to death. Throughout his appeals, Johnson maintained remorse, writing letters to his victims' families. His final request was for a pizza, jelly-filled donuts, and a strawberry milkshake, though he only received the pizza and shake when the donuts were unavailable. Minutes before his execution, he declined to speak. His last written statement thanked his loved ones and apologized for his crimes, lamenting that his victims' families would never find closure. When the single dose of pentobarbital entered his veins, Johnson closed his eyes and slipped into unconsciousness. He was pronounced dead at 11:34 p.m. His execution marked the second federal execution in as many days and underscored the Justice Department's renewed use of capital punishment in the final weeks of the Trump administration. Dustin John Higgs. In the early hours of January 16, 2021, Dustin John Higgs, 48, was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute for orchestrating the January 1996 murders of 3 women at the Patuxent Research Refuge in Maryland. Higgs did not pull the trigger. Instead, he ordered his associate, Willis Haynes, to kill victims Tamika Black, Tangi Jackson, and Mishan Chin to prevent them from reporting a drug robbery. When Haynes refused, Higgs drove him to the site, showed him a firearm, and encouraged him to carry out the killings. Law enforcement captured Higgs in Georgia 2 weeks later, after tracing cell phone records. At trial, a jury found Higgs guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death in 2000. In his final statement, issued as a written letter, he proclaimed his innocence, stating, "I did not order the murders," and naming each victim. His last meal was a steak, a baked potato with butter, a salad with dressing, garlic bread, ice cream, and a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, though the prison denied the requested iced tea. At 1:23 a.m., the single dose of pentobarbital took effect. Witnesses reported he gasped and experienced labored breathing consistent with post-injection complications noted by his attorneys. Higgs's death was the third and final federal execution in January 2021, igniting controversy over administering capital punishment during a lame duck period. Quinton Phipe Jones. On May 19, 2021, Quinton Phipe Jones, a 41-year-old black man from Livingston, Texas, was executed by lethal injection for the 1999 murder of his 87-year-old great-aunt, Berthina Berth Bryant. In October 1999, Jones pistol-whipped and shot Bryant during a home robbery, stealing an unspecified amount of cash. Shortly after the crime, he led authorities on a cross-state chase that ended when Texas Department of Public Safety troopers apprehended him in a wooded area near Houston. A .22 caliber revolver linked him to the murder. During his 2000 trial, prosecutors presented evidence of his prior convictions and argued the killing was particularly egregious given the victim's advanced age. Despite a clemency petition signed by over 120,000 people, including Bryant's own family members, Governor Greg Abbott denied a last-minute reprieve. Jones did not request a special last meal, instead opting for the standard prison menu, an enchilada plate with Spanish rice, refried beans, and vanilla ice cream. Minutes before 6 p.m. Central Time, he offered the chaplain a handshake and told prison staff he forgave them. As the lethal injection began, Jones whispered, "I am so glad to leave this world a better place," referencing his desire to leave behind positive change. His execution ended a decade of appeals and highlighted concerns about racial disparities in clemency decisions within Texas's criminal justice system. John William Hmel. John William Hmel was an honorably discharged Marine whose life took a tragic turn on December 17, 2009. That night in Kennedale, Texas, Hmel fatally stabbed his pregnant wife, Joy, more than 30 times. He then used a baseball bat to bludgeon to death his 5-year-old daughter, Jody, and his 57-year-old father-in-law, Clyde Bedford, who was wheelchair-bound. After the brutal killings, he set the family home aflame, ensuring that their bodies would be discovered only when flames licked through the windows. Authorities responded to the fire and quickly realized that the victims had died by blunt force trauma before the blaze even began. Hmel was arrested at the scene, disoriented and remorseful, admitting to investigators that he snapped under the weight of service-related trauma and personal struggles. During his 2011 trial in Tarrant County, the prosecution described a methodical, premeditated attack, while the defense attempted to introduce his honorable military service and claims of mental anguish. The jury, however, found him guilty of capital murder. They deliberated for only a short period before sentencing him to death. On June 30, 2021, at age 45, Hmel was led to the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. In his final moments, he recited a brief prayer. "Yes, when they lay me down to sleep, for I am to die for justice, the Lord my soul to take. I'll be with Jesus when I wake." He offered thanks to those who supported him and expressed remorse. In compliance with Texas protocol, where special last meal requests had been abolished since 2011, Hmel ate the standard prison meal, the same cafeteria fare served to inmates that day. After his last words, his execution proceeded without ceremony at approximately 6 p.m., ending the life of a man whose honorable beginnings ended in an act of unspeakable violence. Rick Allen Rhodes. Rick Allen Rhodes was sentenced to death for murdering 2 siblings, Bradley Allen and Charles Allen, during a violent home invasion in Harris County, Texas. On September 17, 1998, Rhodes broke into the Allen family home in the early hours, confronting the brother and sister as they slept. Surrounded by evidence of forced entry and a bloody struggle, authorities later discovered that both victims had been brutally shot in cold blood. Rhodes was apprehended within days, taken into custody after a tip from a local resident who recognized his vehicle near the crime scene. At trial, prosecutors presented ballistic evidence and eyewitness testimony linking Rhodes to the slayings. The defense argued diminished capacity, citing his troubled upbringing and substance abuse issues, but the jury was unconvinced. In 1999, Rhodes was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to die. Over the next 2 decades, appeals and stays delayed his execution. However, on September 28, 2021, Rhodes, aged 57, was escorted into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. In his final statement, he apologized to the families of Bradley and Charles, expressing sorrow and claiming that addiction had ruined him. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, voice quivering, "but I pray you find peace." For his last meal, Rhodes requested 2 cheeseburgers, onion rings, 2 large strawberry milkshakes, and a large pepperoni pizza, which he shared with 2 chaplains and a corrections officer. After sipping his milkshake, he declined further food. At 6:15 p.m., a single dose of pentobarbital was administered. As the lethal drug took effect, Rhodes closed his eyes and exhaled one final breath, marking the somber conclusion of a life marked by violence, remorse, and addiction. Ernest Lee Johnson. Ernest Lee Johnson was executed by the state of Missouri for the 1994 home invasion robbery that resulted in the deaths of 3 convenience store workers, Farah Hafrata, Derek Brown, and Charles McCone. A veteran of the U.S. Army, Johnson suffered from significant cognitive impairments. His IQ hovered around 70, placing him at the threshold of intellectual disability. On January 18, 1994, Johnson and accomplices entered the store in Bonne Terre, Missouri. During the robbery, Johnson shot all 3 employees at close range, then fled, leaving police to later find the bodies. He was arrested after witnesses identified his accomplices and traced the getaway vehicle back to him. At trial, Johnson claimed he had not pulled the trigger and that his low mental capacity made him incapable of premeditation. Nonetheless, a jury convicted him of capital murder in 1995, and he received the death sentence. Decades of appeals argued that executing a man with severe cognitive limitations violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Despite widespread calls for clemency, including from Pope Francis and various advocacy groups, courts denied relief. On October 5, 2021, at age 48, Johnson was led into the execution chamber at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center. In a soft voice, he read a written final statement. "I'm sorry for my actions. I want my family to know I love them, and I'm at peace with the Lord." His last meal was 2 double bacon cheeseburgers, onion rings, 2 large strawberry milkshakes, and a large pepperoni pizza. He declined to eat most of it, choosing instead the pizza slice and a few fries. At precisely 6:11 p.m., a single intravenous injection of pentobarbital was administered. After a few moments of labored breathing, Johnson's heart stopped, and the room fell silent, concluding the life of a man whose diminished capacities had sparked a national debate over the ethics of executing intellectually disabled individuals. Willie B Smith III. Willie B Smith III was convicted of the January 1992 murder of an elderly neighbor, Jeannie Barnett, in Mobile, Alabama. At the time, Smith was only 21. He had known Barnett, age 70, as a friendly presence in his neighborhood. One cold January evening, Barnett failed to return inside after locking up her home. Concerned neighbors discovered her body in the living room, her hands bound by a shoelace, and her skull fractured by a blunt object. Investigators traced fingerprints at the scene back to Smith, who had recently pawned several items belonging to Barnett. He was arrested and charged with capital murder. During his 1995 trial, prosecutors revealed that Smith had entered Barnett's home intending to commit robbery, but things escalated violently. The defense claimed Smith suffered from substance abuse and mental health issues, asserting that he had snapped under the influence. Nonetheless, he was convicted and sentenced to death. After years on death row and multiple failed appeals, Smith's execution date was set for October 21, 2021. At 6:05 p.m. that day at Holman Correctional Facility, Smith, aged 52, made his final statement. "I apologize to the Barnett family for taking Jeannie's life. I pray God forgives me." His last meal was a simple tray, a bowl of vanilla pudding, 2 slices of white bread with butter, and a cup of orange drink, the standard prison fare under Alabama's limited last meal policy. As medical staff inserted the 3-drug cocktail, Smith closed his eyes and whispered the Lord's Prayer. Moments later, his breathing ceased and the warden pronounced him dead, concluding the execution of a man whose youth, impairment, and substance issues had collided in a tragic act of violence. John Marian Grant. On October 28, 2021, John Marian Grant, age 60, walked into the Oklahoma State Penitentiary knowing his life would end that night. Grant had been convicted of the 1998 murder of 58-year-old cafeteria worker Gay Carter at a private prison in McAllister. Carter had been finishing her shift, stacking trays, when Grant, a fellow inmate, ambushed her with a homemade shank, stabbing her repeatedly before fleeing into the prison yard. When guards found him, Grant admitted to the attack, claiming he'd snapped under years of confusion and resentment. At trial, prosecutors painted a chilling picture of premeditation, while his defense argued he suffered from severe mental illness and chronic head injuries from childhood accidents. The jury disagreed and sentenced him to death. In the days before his execution, Grant requested a single cheeseburger and a chocolate shake, his attempt to capture a final taste of normalcy. He also asked to listen to gospel hymns, reflecting a fear that his final moments might be consumed by panic. But when midazolam and other drugs were administered, witnesses said Grant's body convulsed, his hands clenching the sheet as if fighting an unseen force. He gasped and vomited, a tragic replay of botched lethal injections that had occurred in Oklahoma years earlier. As his breathing slowed, he whispered, "Lord, have mercy," before falling silent. At 6:11 p.m., the medical team pronounced him dead, ending a fraught chapter in Oklahoma's troubled history of executions. David Neal Cox Sr. On November 17, 2021, the echoing clang of the Parchman gates signaled the final act in David Neal Cox's life, a life marred by betrayal, violence, and broken vows. Cox, 50, was convicted for the May 2010 murder of his wife, Kim Cox, in Sherman, Mississippi. One morning, tucked behind a nondescript grocery store, Cox ambushed his unsuspecting wife as she stepped out of her car, firing 2 shots at close range. He then fled, leading police on a 2-hour chase through winding back roads that ended when his battered pickup truck shattered through a neighbor's fence. At trial, the chilling details emerged. Kim's stepdaughter had survived sexually abusive attacks from Cox years earlier and had testified against him. Cox pleaded guilty to capital murder, sexual battery, and other charges, spurning the possibility of life imprisonment and expressing a twisted desire to forfeit his appeals. In the week before his death, Cox requested a Southern comfort feast: fried catfish, French fries, cornbread, and banana pudding, the kind of meal that felt like home before home had been shattered by his crimes. He spent his final hours writing a letter of remorse, hoping his sons would understand why Daddy did what he did. At 6:12 p.m., the lethal cocktail of midazolam, rocuronium bromide, and potassium chloride coursed through his veins. Witnesses noted Cox's face remained calm as he closed his eyes, a stark contrast to the terror he inflicted on his family. His last breath marked Mississippi's return to execution after nearly a decade, leaving a community grappling with grief and the weight of vengeance. Bigler Job Stafer II. On December 9, 2021, Bigler Job Stafer II, at age 79, became the oldest person executed in Oklahoma since the death penalty's reinstatement. In January 1985, Stafer had stormed into the Oklahoma City home of 35-year-old schoolteacher Linda Reeves, the girlfriend of his ex-wife's current partner. Armed with a .38 caliber pistol, he shot Reeves twice in the head as she slept and wounded her boyfriend, Douglas Ivins, aiming to collect on Ivins' $2 million life insurance. For decades, Stafer maintained he was innocent, even after surviving a 1999 reversal and subsequent reinstatement of his death sentence. In his final statement, Stafer's voice trembled with conviction. "My request is that my father forgive them. Thank you." He insisted the state was executing an innocent man, his decades on death row a testament to a flawed justice system. For his last meal, he declined any special request and chose the standard prison menu: a chicken burger, vegetables, fruit, biscuits, and a simple fruit drink. Hours earlier, he wrote to his daughters, expressing love and claiming he found life without parole more oppressive than death. As the three-drug protocol began, witnesses reported Stafer lying beneath the gurney, clutching the sheet, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as fluid filling his lungs triggered a drowning-like sensation, pulmonary edema that left him convulsing in his final moments. He gasped, his chest heaving, before falling into a long, labored breath. At 6 p.m., the execution team declared him dead. His passing closed a 36-year saga that had divided Oklahoma, raising profound questions about age, innocence claims, and the human cost of capital punishment. Donald Grant. On January 27, 2022, Donald Grant, a 46-year-old black man from Tulsa, Oklahoma, was led into the death chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In April 1996, Grant, then 20, and his accomplice embarked on a home invasion in Tulsa, intending only to steal cash. When they encountered two women, Wendy Ewing and Beverly Miller, Grant panicked and shot them at close range, killing both. A high-speed chase ensued through North Tulsa, with officers eventually cornering Grant's car. He was arrested without resisting, staring straight ahead as though resigned to fate. At trial, Grant admitted to being in the house but claimed he never intended to shoot. The jury rejected his plea and sentenced him to death. Over the next 25 years, Grant's appeals argued intellectual disability and mental impairment, but courts repeatedly denied relief. In his final hours, he requested a pepperoni pizza, a vanilla milkshake, and fried catfish, a last taste of comfort before his end. As the lethal injection began at 6:02 p.m., witnesses described Grant closing his eyes and whispering a prayer for the families of his victims. His final words, delivered in a soft but firm tone, were, "I'm sorry," before slipping into unconsciousness and succumbing to the drugs. Matthew Reeves. Just 9 hours after Grant's execution, Matthew Reeves, a 44-year-old black man, was put to death on January 27, 2022, at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. In August 2004, Reeves volunteered to help his neighbor, Dallas County Sheriff's Deputy Russell Lewis, with yard work. When Lewis went inside to fetch tools, Reeves grabbed the deputy's shotgun and shot him fatally in the back. Reeves then stole Lewis's car and fled, leading deputies on a harrowing pursuit that ended when Reeves crashed into a ditch. At trial, Reeves testified that he blamed Lewis for falsely arresting his mother years earlier, fueling his rage. The jury, however, found that his actions were planned and cold-blooded, sentencing him to death. In his final statement, Reeves claimed remorse but insisted his childhood made me this way. For his last meal, he requested a double cheeseburger, a large order of fries, and a chocolate milkshake, choices that prison officials delivered in standard portions. As the sedative entered his veins, Reeves mouthed, "Mama, forgive me," to his estranged family before gasping his last breath at 10:15 p.m., bringing a painful end to a life marked by bitterness and loss. Gilbert Postell. On February 17, 2022, Gilbert Postell, a 35-year-old white man, walked unflinchingly into the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In April 2005, Postell and two friends robbed a home in Norman, Oklahoma, seeking money to purchase methamphetamine. Inside the bedroom, they encountered Russell Lewis, no relation to the deputy, and his girlfriend, Rhonda Matthews, who was 8 months pregnant. Postell shot Lewis 3 times and Matthews once. The couple's infant daughter hid under a crib, miraculously unharmed. Postell fled to Arkansas but was captured 2 days later after a neighbor recognized him from a news bulletin. At trial, Postell admitted to pulling the trigger, expressing deep regret and pleading for forgiveness for his brutal actions. Diagnosed with schizophrenia in prison, he spent years on constant medication and counseling. In his final hours, he wrote letters to Lewis's surviving children, apologizing for the void he created in their lives. His last meal was a bowl of chili, cornbread, chocolate pudding, and a 2-liter bottle of root beer, simple requests reflecting a desire for familiar comforts. As nurses administered the lethal injection at 6 p.m., Postell remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He breathed heavily for nearly a minute before falling still, leaving behind a legacy of violence tinged with profound remorse. Carl Wayne Bunchon. On April 21, 2022, Carl Wayne Bunchon, age 78, was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. In February 1976, Bunchon and accomplice Burl Clipper sexually assaulted and strangled 18-year-old Lisa Jones in her Pasadena home. After the murder, Bunchon and Clipper stole Jones's car and fled to Louisiana, where they were apprehended by local officers responding to a vehicle theft report. At his 1977 trial in Harris County, Bunchon insisted he was innocent and blamed Clipper for the killing, but the jury concluded that Bunchon had actively participated in the attack. Sentencing evidence revealed Bunchon's prior convictions for armed robbery and burglary, painting a picture of a man hardened by decades of crime. Over nearly 45 years on death row, Bunchon maintained his innocence, filing repeated appeals and requesting clemency, only to be denied by successive governors. In his final hours, he declined a special last meal, opting for the standard prison fare: a tray of grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, white rice, and vanilla pudding from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice menu. Moments before the execution, Bunchon turned to the warden and whispered, "I forgive you." He offered no other words. When the lethal drugs entered his veins at precisely 6 p.m., his breathing grew shallow and labored. Within minutes, the IV line delivered the final dose, and he fell silent. His death closed a case marked by a brutal home invasion, a young woman's life stolen, and a prisoner who spent almost half a century behind bars, haunted by his crime and his protests of innocence. Carmen L Deck. On May 3, 2022, Carmen L Deck, age 56, was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. In January 1993, Deck, then 26, forcibly broke into the home of 89-year-old Marian in Fredericktown. Unbeknownst to the sleeping couple, Deck planned to rob them, hoping to settle drug debts. In the dim hallway, he encountered Heckart and his wife. Panic set in when the elderly man confronted him. Deck struck Heckart repeatedly with a metal pipe, bludgeoning him to death. When the victim's wife awoke, Deck shot her in the head as she tried to flee. He then ransacked the house, absconding with a small amount of cash and some jewelry. Neighbors raised the alarm after noticing the broken lock and a trail of blood on the front porch. At trial, prosecutors underscored the cold-blooded nature of the attack on two defenseless seniors. The defense pointed to Deck's history of childhood abuse and addiction. The jury sentenced him to death in April 1993. In the lead-up to his execution, Deck requested a last meal of fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, green beans, and chocolate cake, comfort food that he said reminded him of his mother's cooking. Minutes before his death, he spoke softly to the victim's family through a translator, offering his remorse and asking for forgiveness, stating, "I understand there is no excuse for what I did." At 6 p.m., as the lethal injection flowed, Deck closed his eyes and exhaled his final breath. His passing marked Missouri's fourth execution in 5 years, and served as a stark reminder of the tragic, senseless violence inflicted on two innocent seniors. Clarence Wayne Dixon. On May 11, 2022, Clarence Wayne Dixon, age 66, became the first person executed in Arizona since 2014 when he walked calmly into the execution chamber at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. In January 1978, 21-year-old Arizona State University student Dina Bowdoin was found brutally raped and strangled behind the campus dorms. The case went cold until 2001, when DNA evidence linked Dixon, convicted earlier for unrelated sexual assaults, to Bowdoin's murder. Investigators discovered that Dixon had used a stolen pickup truck to drive Bowdoin to a remote area, where he attacked her. Although Dixon was serving a life sentence for a 1986 rape conviction, the new forensic breakthrough led to his trial in January 2008, where a Maricopa County jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death after acknowledging his guilt but maintaining he hadn't intended to kill her. In the weeks before his execution, Dixon requested a slice of chocolate cake and a bowl of vanilla ice cream, drawing on memories of family gatherings he could only imagine after decades on death row. He spent his final day listening to hymns and writing letters to surviving family members of his victim, expressing a hollow remorse that drew both sympathy and outrage. Shortly before 9 a.m., he delivered a brief statement. "I'll carry this with me into eternity, that my sin has left a family shattered." As the single dose of pentobarbital was administered, Dixon's body tensed, then relaxed. Within moments, his breathing became shallow, and he slipped into quiet stillness. His death ended the nation's longest gap between executions in a single state and spotlighted painful questions about justice, closure, and the power of DNA to unearth cold cases decades later. Frank Jarvis Atwood. Frank Jarvis Atwood's story is one of haunting tragedy and enduring controversy. In September 1984, 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson disappeared while riding her bicycle to mail a birthday card. Her abandoned bicycle, found a few blocks from home, sparked a desperate search that ended months later when her skeletal remains were discovered in the desert north of Tucson. Atwood, then a drifter recently paroled for child molestation in California, became a suspect when forensic investigators matched pink paint from Vicky's bike to his car's bumper and found nickel plating from the bumper on the bicycle frame. Witnesses also placed Atwood near the mailbox around the time of her disappearance. He was arrested in Texas when his parents reported his car breaking down in Kerrville. The FBI detained him at a mechanic shop. During his 1987 trial in Phoenix, the jury convicted him of kidnapping and felony murder, rejecting his claims that evidence was planted. He was sentenced to death. A verdict bitterly contested by his attorneys for relying on circumstantial evidence. Spending nearly 35 years on Arizona's death row, Atwood maintained his innocence, earning degrees in English and literature, writing books, and converting to Greek Orthodox Christianity. In the weeks before his execution, Atwood declined a special last meal, stating he was fasting, then dramatically reversed course, requesting a sack nasty meal, salami, mustard, peanut butter, jelly, wheat bread, tortilla chips, and water with a juice packet. When clemency was unanimously denied on May 24, 2022, Atwood was granted a final visit from religious advisors. He wore white and lay on the gurney as a priest placed a hand on him. Witnesses described the process as peaceful. In his final statement, Atwood expressed gratitude to his wife, friends, legal team, and, most of all, Jesus Christ through this unfair judicial process that led to my salvation, urging mercy for all souls. He did not directly apologize to Vicky's family. Their outrage and lingering doubts about his guilt continue to spark debate about Arizona's capital punishment practices. Atwood was pronounced dead at 10:16 a.m. by lethal injection. Joe Nathan James Jr. Joe Nathan James Jr.'s execution in Alabama was fraught with raw emotion, unexpected delays, and deep divisions. Convicted for the August 15, 1994, murder of his ex-girlfriend Faith Hall, James was portrayed at trial as a man tormented by obsession. Prosecutors detailed years of stalking and harassment. Faith, then 26, reported James repeatedly threatened her, broke into her home, ever present in her driveway, desperate after she ended their relationship. On the night she was killed, James burst into her apartment, chased her down a hallway with a gun, and shot her 3 times at close range, pressuring through shattered doors to strike as her friends and children fled. The jury in Jefferson County convicted him of capital murder in 1996, even as Faith's daughters and brother publicly begged for mercy, stating they had forgiven James and wanted life imprisonment instead of execution. His conviction was overturned on appeal due to evidentiary errors, but a retrial in 1999 again returned a death verdict. James converted to Islam on death row, married, and maintained a largely clean disciplinary record, though he never formally apologized to Faith's family. On July 28, 2022, James's execution began at 6 p.m. at Holman Correctional Facility. Witnesses recounted an agonizing delay. Prison officials struggled for over 3 hours to establish an intravenous line, at times attempting access through his knuckles and wrists, causing bruising and puncture wounds. James refused a last meal, eating lunch but declining dinner. When finally sedated with pentobarbital, he lay in the death chamber for approximately 3 hours before lethal doses were successfully administered. He did not speak when asked for final words. As the drugs took effect, James remained motionless, leaving onlookers uncertain if he was conscious. He was pronounced dead at 9:27 p.m., marking what is believed to be the longest execution by lethal injection in U.S. history. Faith Hall's family opted not to attend, reiterating their wishes for clemency, but released a statement expressing continued forgiveness and urging reflection on capital punishment's human cost. Alabama's governor called for a brief moratorium following the botched procedures. James's death ignited renewed scrutiny of lethal injection protocols, the state's press room dress code controversies, and the ethical weight of carrying out sentences against family pleas, underscoring the fraught intersection of vengeance, mercy, and justice. Kosul Chantakum. Kosul Chantakum's life and death tapped into broader controversies about forensic science, immigrant experiences, and mercy. Born to Laotian immigrants, Chantakum migrated to the U.S. as a teenager. On July 8, 2006, real estate agent Sarah Walker was found in a Collin County model home, brutally beaten and stabbed 33 times. Investigators linked bite mark evidence on her back and DNA under her fingernails to Chantakum. Witnesses, having been hypnotized by police, placed an Asian man resembling him at the scene. Though Chantakum adamantly professed innocence, claiming he was merely in the area delivering pizzas that day, jurors in McKinney convicted him of capital murder. His death sentence was imposed in 2007. Over the next 15 years, his attorneys eroded the bite mark evidence's reliability. Forensic science now widely rejects such matches and challenged hypnosis-induced witness testimony. Still, courts held that DNA taken from Walker's under-fingernail scrapings and at the scene convincingly implicated him. Chantakum's final appeals, filed shortly before his scheduled execution, asserted that updated junk science statutes in Texas should overturn convictions based on discredited forensics. All clemency petitions failed, despite a heartfelt plea from Walker's own father, who publicly forgave Chantakum and urged mercy. On August 17, 2022, Chantakum, age 41, was led into the Huntsville unit's death chamber, calm but resolute. He refused special last meal requests, remaining focused on his final statement. To Ms. Walker's family, I pray my death will bring you peace. Injecting 5 grams of pentobarbital into veins in both arms at 6:18 p.m., officials pronounced him dead at 6:33 p.m. His last moments were witnessed by his mother through a glass partition. He mouthed, "Mom, I love you," as the drugs took hold. Witnesses noted he looked toward a window where she stood, silent tears in both their eyes. No family members of the victim attended. In his final seconds, Chantakum blinked, gasped, and yielded to a lethal dose that ended his life 15 minutes after sedation began. Beyond his individual narrative, Texas's execution of Chantakum fueled debates over the death penalty's finality, particularly in cases with questionable evidence, and spotlighted the emotional toll on all who touch such cases. James Allen Codington. James Allen Codington's trajectory from childhood turmoil to a violent crime spree culminated in a shocking execution in Oklahoma. Born March 22, 1972, into a broken home where his mother was imprisoned and his father's alcoholism inflicted severe abuse, Codington drifted into drug addiction and petty crime from a young age. By March 6, 1997, at age 24, a high on cocaine Codington visited his 73-year-old friend Albert Troy Hale in Oklahoma City, asking for $50 to feed his addiction. When Hale refused, Codington grabbed a claw hammer and struck the elderly man's head repeatedly until Hale's death. Codington then stole $520 from Hale's home, fled, and embarked on a string of convenience store robberies before capture. Evidence solidified his guilt: blood spatter, stolen cash, and eyewitness accounts. Convicted and sentenced to death in 2003, Codington's appeals highlighted his horrific upbringing and efforts at rehabilitation, earning a GED, avoiding drugs, and maintaining a clean disciplinary record on death row. In a rare 3-2 recommendation, Oklahoma's parole board even urged Governor Stitt to commute his sentence, citing his remorse and transformation. Instead, clemency was denied, reflecting staunch support for capital punishment by Hale's surviving family. On August 25, 2022, at Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Codington ate a final meal of 2 cheeseburgers, 2 crunchy fish sandwiches, 2 large fries, and a large soda, a stark contrast to his battered life. The lethal injection process began at 10:16 a.m. No complications were reported by media witnesses. Before the sedative took effect, Codington delivered a brief final statement. To all my family and friends, lawyers, everyone who's been around me and loved me, thank you. Governor Stitt, I don't blame you, and I forgive you. He did not apologize to Albert Hale's family. If his death brought any solace, it was fleeting. Hale's son Mitchell commented that witnessing Codington's execution did not ease his grief, though he felt justice had been served. At 10:16 a.m., the state pronounced him dead. Codington's execution was part of a broader death row purge, as Oklahoma resumed capital punishment after a long moratorium, raising questions about the ethics of executing individuals whose crimes are deeply rooted in trauma and addiction. John Henry Ramirez. John Henry Ramirez's case intertwined questions of religious freedom, redemption, and an agonizing crime. Born June 29, 1984, Ramirez enlisted in the Marines but struggled after discharge. On July 19, 2004, 20-year-old Ramirez and 2 acquaintances entered a Corpus Christi convenience store. Seeking money for drugs, he stabbed 46-year-old clerk Pablo Castro 29 times while the victim took out trash. They stole $1.25 and fled to Mexico. Ramirez remained a fugitive until 2008. Convicted of capital murder in 2009, he was sentenced to death in 2010. Prison became a turbulent journey of faith. Ramirez converted to Christianity, maintaining a close bond with his pastor, who petitioned to lay hands and pray audibly during Ramirez's execution, rights Texas's protocol initially barred. He twice avoided execution. In September 2021, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Texas's refusal to permit his pastor's touch and prayer likely violated Rhodess and the First Amendment, granting an 8-1 stay and a groundbreaking affirmation of religious rights behind death chamber walls. On October 5, 2022, Ramirez faced the Huntsville unit's lethal injection chamber. He did not request a last meal, eating lunch earlier and refusing dinner. At 6:27 p.m., 2 IV lines were successfully inserted into his arms, and 5 grams of pentobarbital began flowing. Witnesses from the victim's family watched, escorted by correctional officers. Before the injection, Ramirez addressed Castro's children directly, expressing regret and remorse, and hoping his death would help them find closure. He thanked his pastor and supporters, acknowledging his spiritual journey. 14 minutes later, at 6:41 p.m., he was pronounced dead. His final words and the Supreme Court's earlier decision spotlighted a tension between state authority and profound human needs at the brink of death. The execution concluded Ramirez's tumultuous 8-year odyssey on death row and left the community grappling with whether his pursuit of redemption, faith, and a pastor's touch in his dying moments had found meaning, or was shattered irreparably by the finality of the lethal injection. Benjamin Robert Cole Sr. On October 20, 2022, Benjamin Robert Cole Sr., a 57-year-old former Child Protective Services investigator from Mississippi, faced the end of a life marked by unspeakable cruelty. In June 2002, Cole brutally murdered his 9-month-old daughter, Brianna, by bending her body until her ankles collapsed behind her head, an act of unparalleled brutality born from his deranged convictions. After the heinous crime, Cole surrendered to authorities in Oklahoma, admitting to the atrocity and confessing to previous deceptions that allowed him to hide his predatory nature. In his trial, the prosecution introduced harrowing evidence of the infant's broken bones and contorted limbs. Cole's defense team argued diminished capacity, but the jury rejected any mitigation and sentenced him to death. In his final hours at Parchman, Cole requested a standard cafeteria meal and a quiet vigil with only a Bible for comfort. As the lethal injection began at 10:10 a.m., witnesses reported Cole closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. His last murmured words were, "I failed her," before darkness claimed him. Tracy Lane Batty. On November 9, 2022, Tracy Lane Batty, a 61-year-old white man from Texas, was executed at the Walls Unit in Huntsville for strangling his 68-year-old mother, Carolyn Click, during a domestic dispute in November 2003. Batty, who had an extensive history of mental illness and substance abuse, argued throughout his decades on death row that he was ineligible for execution due to intellectual disability. At trial, prosecutors detailed how Batty entered his mother's East Texas home, where he lived, and attacked her during a heated argument, then dumped her body behind their house. Despite his attorney's pleas that he needed proper uncuffed mental health evaluations, the courts refused, and Batty's sentence remained intact. In his final statement, Batty professed remorse. "I'm sorry, Mama. I love you," before embracing a prison chaplain and closing his eyes. He declined a special last meal, eating the standard prison menu. When the single dose of pentobarbital coursed through his veins at 6:01 p.m., he exhaled slowly one final time and was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. Murray Hooper. Murray Hooper, age 76, was executed by lethal injection in Arizona on November 16, 2022, for the 1980 murders of William Pat Redmond and his mother-in-law, Helen Phelps, in Phoenix. At trial, the evidence revealed that Hooper, a small-time bookie, was hired by a rival who coveted Redmond's printing business. Hooper stalked Redmond's home, then burst in and gunned down Redmond and Phelps, leaving Redmond's wife, Marian, for dead. Captured weeks later, Hooper confessed and expressed little remorse, insisting business is business as his sole motive. Over the decades on death row, he maintained a stoic silence, refusing contact with victims' families. In his final hours at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, Hooper declined a last meal, sitting quietly in a white suit. Minutes before sunrise, as the sedative wiped away consciousness, Hooper's body tensed in the gurney, then relaxed. He uttered no final words. At 5:54 a.m., the warden announced his death, closing a chapter on a crime that had shattered two families more than 40 years earlier. Stephen Dale Barbie. On November 16, 2022, Stephen Dale Barbie, a 55-year-old white man from Fort Worth, Texas, was executed at the Huntsville unit for the November 2005 murders of his pregnant ex-girlfriend, Faith Hall, and her 7-year-old son. Barbie had stalked Hall relentlessly after their breakup, forcing her to relocate multiple times. On that fateful night, he forced his way into her apartment, chased her down a hallway and shot her as she screamed. Then he executed her terrified son. Barbie led police on a high-speed chase before crashing his truck and surrendering. During his 2007 trial, witnesses testified about his threats and obsession. The jury rejected his pleas of residual emotion from their relationship and imposed the death penalty. In his final moments, Barbie declined a special last meal, eating the standard prison dinner. As the fourth team searched for a suitable vein, he struggled to keep his arms steady. 2 hours later, with veins finally accessed, 5 grams of pentobarbital coursed through his veins. Barbie remained silent, staring at the ceiling until his chest stopped moving. At 7:35 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Richard Stephen Fairchild. Richard Stephen Fairchild, age 63, went to his death at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary on November 17, 2022, for the 1993 torture slaying of his girlfriend's 3-year-old stepson, Adam Broomhall. Fairchild, a U.S. Marine veteran, had shattered the child's skull with a heavy blow after accusing him of wetting the bed. When authorities arrived, they found Adam's body cold and lifeless, Fairchild standing over him in a daze. At his trial, neighbors testified about repeated child screams the night before, and medical examiners detailed skull fractures and internal bleeding consistent with brutal force. Fairchild pleaded guilty, but disputed his mental competency, citing PTSD from service. The jury sentenced him to death. In his final hours, he requested chocolate pudding and a vanilla milkshake, remnants of childhood comfort. Shortly before 10 a.m., as the lethal cocktail began, Fairchild whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Then his body convulsed once before stilling. He was pronounced dead at 10:24 a.m., marking his last breath in the very barracks where his military career had once begun. Kevin Johnson, Jr. On November 29, 2022, Kevin Johnson, Jr., a 37-year-old black man from Missouri, faced execution at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center for the January 2005 murder of Kansas City police officer Michael J. Burbridge. In the early morning hours, Officer Burbridge stopped Johnson, who was driving a stolen vehicle. Fearing capture for previous crimes, Johnson shot him twice in the head, execution style, then fled. Caught after a manhunt, Johnson admitted to the killing and claimed he panicked. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, emphasizing the officer's service and the chilling nature of the ambush. At trial, Johnson expressed no remorse until sentencing, then broke down, sobbing. Over 17 years on death row, he participated in mental health programs but maintained his guilt. For his last meal, he requested chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a chocolate milkshake. Comfort food reminding him of his youth. As the single dose of pentobarbital flowed into his veins, Johnson closed his eyes and said, "Sorry, sir," to Burbridge's widow, before slipping into oblivion. At 6:52 p.m., the warden pronounced his death. Thomas Edwin Loen, Jr. Thomas Edwin Loen, Jr., age 58, a former U.S. Marine recruiter, was executed by lethal injection at Mississippi State Penitentiary on December 14, 2022, for the June 2000 abduction, rape, and murder of 16-year-old Lisa Marie Gray. After Loden's van broke down, he offered Gray help. Instead, he forced her into his vehicle, violently sexually assaulted her for hours, then strangled her to death. Gray's bound body was discovered in Loden's van, while Loen lay nearby with "I'm sorry" carved into his chest. At his 2001 trial, Loen pleaded guilty, citing PTSD from combat, but the jury rejected mental health defenses and sentenced him to death. In his final statement, Loen expressed genuine remorse for Gray's family, saying, "I'm sorry, Wanda." He requested fried pork chops, okra, a sweet potato, biscuits with molasses, peach cobbler with ice cream, and sweet tea, finishing nearly all. As officers secured 4 lines, Loen held his daughter's photograph close. When the pentobarbital entered his bloodstream at 6 p.m., Loen exhaled slowly, closed his eyes, and, after 1 minute of shallow breathing, was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. thank you for exploring these somber final chapters. Their stories remind us of the complex human cost behind every execution. If these accounts moved you, share this video to foster dialogue about justice and redemption. Until next time, stay curious and compassionate as we uncover more truths in the shadows.